Among history's most feared and controversial names, Jimmy Hoffa was born on the 14th of February in the year 1913 in Brazil, Indiana. From his earliest days, Hoffa stood out not for charm or charisma, but for his raw intensity and refusal to back down. He grew up fast and hard in a world that gave no second chances. His journey from a working-class boy to one of the most powerful and polarizing labor leaders in America is one of ambition, power, and mystery. Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Hoffa's childhood was shaped by loss and labor. His father died when Jimmy was only 7 years old, and by the age of 14, he had left school to support his struggling family. But this wasn't a story of quiet survival. It was the beginning of a fierce rise. Working in grocery warehouses, young Hoffa saw firsthand how badly workers were treated. Instead of accepting it, he started organizing strikes. It wasn't long before Hoffa's sharp instincts and unshakable will caught the attention of the powerful International Brotherhood of Teamsters. By the 1930s, he had already become a formidable figure within union circles in Detroit. What made him so dangerous to his enemies and valuable to his allies was his readiness to use any tool to get what he wanted. Loyalty, strategy, intimidation, or even force. To some, he was a hero of the working man. To others, he was a ruthless operator tangled with the Mafia. But one thing was certain, Jimmy Hoffa was never afraid to fight for control, no matter the cost. Jimmy Hoffa's childhood was defined by hardship, responsibility, and an early loss of innocence. Born to John and Viola Hoffa, he was the third of 4 children. His father, a coal miner of Pennsylvania Dutch background, died of lung disease in the year 1920, leaving 7-year-old Jimmy and his siblings to grow up without a guiding hand. Their mother, of Irish descent, took on the burden of raising the family alone. And in 1924, they relocated to Detroit, a city on the edge of industrial transformation. Life in Detroit was far from glamorous. Young Hoffa left school at just 14 years old to help support the family. He began working in backbreaking manual labor jobs, including long hours in warehouse and grocery operations. But rather than breaking his spirit, this environment sharpened his instincts. He saw the desperation in his fellow workers' eyes, the unfair wages, and the lack of safety or security, and it lit a fire inside him. By the time he was a teenager, Hoffa had already begun organizing workers. During a laundry strike, where he met his future wife, Josephine Poziwak, he stood on picket lines, faced down management, and found that he had both the courage and the voice to lead others. He wasn't educated in the classical sense, but he possessed a natural intelligence and a boldness that few could match. Hoffa's early years gave him a deep understanding of working-class pain and a hatred for exploitation. These early experiences weren't just the start of a career, they were the roots of a movement he would later command with unstoppable force. By the early 1930s, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just another laborer. He had become a fierce young organizer with a growing reputation among Detroit's warehouse and trucking workers. At just 19 years old, he joined Local 299 of the Teamsters, one of America's emerging labor unions, and quickly proved he was more than capable of handling tough negotiations and even tougher bosses. He wasn't afraid to confront authority. In fact, he thrived on it. Hoffa famously walked away from a grocery chain job after standing up to an abusive shift foreman, an act that didn't just show defiance, but demonstrated leadership. He began organizing workers by pulling his car over near sleeping truck drivers and waking them up to deliver fiery, persuasive speeches about unity and strength. His approach was relentless. He understood the fears and frustrations of truckers because he lived them. But unlike others, Hoffa had a gift for turning frustration into action. He talked to workers like a brother, not a boss. He was approachable, persuasive, and unyielding. Within just a few years, Hoffa helped consolidate scattered trucking locals across Detroit and eventually the Midwest, building momentum for a national force. While others hesitated, Hoffa moved forward. His union work wasn't polished or elegant, but it was effective, and it drew the attention of both labor leaders and dangerous men from the world of organized crime. Still in his 20s, Hoffa was transforming from a teenage street-level organizer into a warrior for union power. He wasn't just speaking for the workers anymore, he was preparing to lead them in battle. In the midst of the Great Depression and into the Second World War era, Jimmy Hoffa helped engineer one of the most explosive periods of growth in American labor history. The Teamsters Union, which had about 75,000 members in 1933, would soon swell into a powerful machine, thanks in large part to Hoffa's unrelenting drive and strategic mind. Hoffa understood that the future of the labor movement depended on unity, and he was willing to do whatever it took to create it. With bold tactics like quickie strikes, secondary boycotts, and high-stakes showdowns with company bosses, he consolidated dozens of independent trucker groups into one national structure. His ability to strike deals, settle disputes, and outmaneuver opponents made him a feared and respected figure on all sides. By 1936, Teamster membership had grown to 170,000. Just 3 years later, it reached 420,000. Hoffa was the engine behind that expansion, negotiating contracts and organizing not just drivers, but warehouse workers and other logistics laborers across the country. By the early 1950s, the Teamsters boasted over 1 million members, the largest union in the United States. But such meteoric growth came at a price. In many cities, especially Detroit, Chicago, and New York, trucking routes were controlled by mob-linked outfits. To secure territory and keep union workers protected, Hoffa made informal deals with organized crime figures, a shadowy alliance that would one day haunt him. Still, to the average Teamster, Hoffa was a champion. He brought better wages, job security, and national recognition to a once fragmented workforce. With every deal signed and territory gained, the empire he built grew stronger, and so did the risks. By the early 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a Detroit labor leader, he was a national force. At the 1952 Teamsters Convention in Los Angeles, Hoffa was appointed National Vice President by Dave Beck, the newly elected president. Hoffa had helped secure Beck's victory in exchange for that powerful position. It was a calculated move, and it paid off. With the headquarters moved to Washington, D.C., and a rapidly growing membership, Hoffa had stepped into the center of American labor politics. He traveled constantly, handling disputes, making backroom deals, and solidifying his influence in nearly every major city. Though he had never driven a truck himself, Hoffa's authority among truckers and union officials was unmatched. His personal lawyer, Bill Bufalino, helped shield him from legal challenges, while Hoffa's own force of will silenced dissenters. But Hoffa's growing clout also attracted scrutiny. The federal government, especially through the McClellan Committee, began to investigate corruption in labor unions, and Hoffa became a central figure. Still, his popularity among workers didn't fade. When Dave Beck fell from grace in 1957, convicted of fraud and refusing to testify before Congress, Hoffa stepped up as president of the Teamsters. From Miami Beach to the Midwest, Hoffa was seen as the man who could get things done. He promised not only stronger contracts and better wages, but also to protect union power from corporate and political interference. His leadership style was tough, direct, and unflinching. Hoffa had officially become one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history. But his rapid rise had made him enemies in the government and dangerous rivals within the criminal underworld. With his grip tightening on the Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa's methods began drawing deeper suspicion, and for good reason. To many of his enemies, he wasn't just a labor leader. He was a man who had made deals with the devil. Organized crime had always hovered near the trucking industry, but under Hoffa's reign, the lines between union business and the Mafia became dangerously blurred. In cities like Detroit, New York, and Chicago, Hoffa developed relationships with powerful mob figures. Men like Anthony Provenzano and the Giacolone brothers didn't just control businesses, they controlled fear. Hoffa believed that by working with them, he could secure better contracts, protect his men from violence, and keep the union dominant. But those deals came with costs, loyalty, silence, and eventually, blood. Government investigators, led by the Kennedy brothers, especially Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched aggressive campaigns against Hoffa. In the early 60s, Robert Kennedy assembled a dedicated Get Hoffa squad determined to expose corruption and tie him directly to the Mafia. Hoffa denied all charges, calling it a political witch hunt. But behind the scenes, his union's pension fund was being used as a piggy bank, with mob-tied investments, secret deals, and untraceable kickbacks. Despite the mounting pressure, Hoffa stood his ground. He knew who he had allied with, and he believed he could outmaneuver anyone. But cracks began to show. Former allies turned informants. Trusted men started keeping their distance. The cost of power and his entanglement with criminals was catching up. Hoffa had built an empire with iron fists and whispered promises. But as enemies closed in, even he couldn't control the storm he had unleashed. The 1960s marked the beginning of Jimmy Hoffa's long and painful fall. His reign as president of the Teamsters was now under siege, not from his workers, but from federal prosecutors, judges, and a government that had made him their #1 target. Robert Kennedy, leading the Justice Department, was relentless. Hoffa, who had once seemed untouchable, now faced a wall of legal trouble he could no longer dodge. In 1964, after years of surveillance and court battles, Hoffa was finally convicted in 2 separate trials. The first conviction was for jury tampering in Tennessee, where he was found guilty of trying to bribe a juror. The second, far more damaging, was for mail and wire fraud and conspiracy related to the misuse of the union's massive pension fund. Together, the charges brought him a 13-year sentence. While appealing his convictions, Hoffa continued to run the union, but the pressure was unrelenting. His reputation was battered, and even among allies, doubts were growing. In public, he remained defiant, giving interviews and appearing at rallies, promising to clear his name. Privately, however, he understood the tide was turning against him. On March 7, 1967, Hoffa entered the federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. For the first time in decades, he was cut off from his union, his power base, and the public stage he had commanded so fiercely. The fall of Jimmy Hoffa wasn't sudden. It was dragged out over years of resistance, courtroom drama, and bitter feuds. But as he walked through those prison gates, even he knew the empire he had built was beginning to crumble. Life behind bars did not silence Jimmy Hoffa, it only hardened his resolve. At the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, he lived under tight supervision, yet he remained determined to control the Teamsters from the inside. Initially, he tried to operate the union through his longtime ally Frank Fitzsimmons, whom he had personally elevated. But once in power, Fitzsimmons began distancing himself, decentralizing authority and building his own loyal following, leaving Hoffa increasingly isolated. Prison life was a bitter pill. For a man who had once commanded millions, the confines of a cell were humiliating. Still, Hoffa used every legal option to fight back. His appeals were pushed all the way to the Supreme Court, but they failed. As the years wore on, his influence in the outside world continued to shrink. Then, in a stunning twist, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence on December 23, 1971, after Hoffa had served nearly 5 years. The deal, however, came with a major catch. He was barred from participating in union activities until 1980. Hoffa publicly denied agreeing to that condition, accusing Nixon's administration of betrayal and even hinting at backroom pressure from within the Teamsters themselves. The commutation came with a hefty reward. Hoffa received a $1.75 million termination benefit, a payout from the Teamsters pension plan, never before granted to any former president. But it wasn't freedom Hoffa craved, it was power. And despite the legal shackles, he had no intention of fading quietly. Jimmy Hoffa walked out of prison a free man, but not a defeated one. He was already planning his next move, a comeback that would shake the foundations of the labor world once again. Jimmy Hoffa's release from prison didn't bring him peace. It reignited his thirst for power. Despite the restriction that barred him from union activity until 1980, Hoffa launched a full-blown campaign to reclaim control of the Teamsters. He argued that he had never agreed to the terms imposed by President Nixon and accused the administration and his own successor, Frank Fitzsimmons, of conspiring to keep him out. But the landscape had changed. Fitzsimmons had solidified his leadership, and many in the union preferred stability over Hoffa's fiery return. Even more dangerously, the Mafia figures who had once benefited from Hoffa's rule now saw him as a threat. They feared his comeback would disrupt the balance of power and expose decades of secret dealings, especially concerning the Teamsters' massive pension fund. Hoffa wasn't blind to the danger. He started small, trying to rebuild his base through Local 299 in Detroit. He met quietly with old allies, gave interviews, and even began working on an autobiography titled Hoffa, The Real Story, to reframe his legacy. Yet everywhere he turned, he encountered resistance from former friends, rivals, and organized crime bosses who wanted him to stay quiet. Still, Hoffa pushed forward, convinced that he could outmaneuver them all. He refused to fade into retirement and saw himself as the rightful leader, cheated of his place. To Hoffa, stepping aside was never an option. But what he didn't realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that his enemies were no longer just political or legal. They were deadly, and his defiance was drawing him closer to the point of no return. On the 30th of July, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa left his home in Lake Orion, Michigan, intending to meet two men, Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, at the Mac's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. The meeting, supposedly arranged to resolve tensions, was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But Hoffa was never seen again. He arrived early and waited in the parking lot. At 2:15 in the afternoon, frustrated and agitated, he called his wife from a payphone behind the restaurant, complaining that no one had shown up. He told her he would be home by 4 o'clock to grill steaks. Several witnesses reported seeing Hoffa pacing outside his car, greeting acquaintances, and making a second phone call. Then, around 2:45, he vanished. His car, unlocked, with no signs of struggle, was found the next morning in the same parking lot. Hoffa's longtime associate, Charles Chucky O'Brien, had been seen driving a maroon Mercury that day, one later linked to the Giacalone family. Inside, police dogs detected Hoffa's scent, and a strand of his hair was found on the seat. Despite immediate action by police, the FBI and the Teamsters, no trace of Hoffa was ever found. Theories exploded. Was he lured into the car and killed elsewhere? Was he cremated, buried, or dumped into the Great Lakes? Rumors ranged from a Detroit house to a landfill under Giants Stadium. Hoffa had enemies in high places and friends who had turned cold. The man who once ruled America's largest union vanished without a trace in broad daylight, leaving behind only questions, fear, and one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance sparked one of the most intense investigations in American history. Theories multiplied, suspects were named, and tips poured in from across the country. Yet despite years of inquiry, no one has ever been charged with his murder, and no body has ever been found. Many investigators believe Hoffa was lured into a car by someone he trusted, possibly Charles "Chucky" O'Brien, and then delivered to a location where he was killed. O'Brien, once like a foster son to Hoffa, had grown distant in later years. Though he denied involvement, a strand of Hoffa's hair was found in a car O'Brien had used that day. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. The FBI's 1976 Hoffa's memo identified 3 likely suspects: Salvatore Briglio, his brother Gabriel, and Thomas Andretta, all close to Mafia leader Anthony Provenzano. Some believe Hoffa was killed at a Detroit house and cremated. Others point to a landfill in New Jersey. Dig sites were searched, including under the Pulaski Skyway and even Giants Stadium, but nothing was ever found. Mob insiders, including Michael Franzese and Frank the Irishman Sheeran, have offered conflicting accounts. Sheeran famously claimed in a book that he personally shot Hoffa, but his version has been widely disputed. Other sources claim the body was burned, dissolved, or buried deep in concrete. What remains certain is that Hoffa's comeback effort threatened powerful men both inside the Union and within the Mafia. And when men like Hoffa become inconvenient, they tend to disappear. With every passing decade, new theories arise and old suspects die off. But the truth remains buried along with the man himself in silence, shadows, and unbroken loyalty to secrets. Decades after his disappearance, Jimmy Hoffa's name still stirs both admiration and fear. To some, he was a fearless labor champion who fought for working-class Americans with unmatched determination. To others, he was a corrupt union boss who sold his soul to organized crime. But one truth is undeniable: Hoffa changed the landscape of American labor forever. Under his leadership, the Teamsters became the largest and most powerful union in the country. He fought for better wages, health benefits, and job security for millions of truckers and warehouse workers. His tactics were bold, often ruthless, but effective. For many, Hoffa was the reason they could support their families and retire with dignity. But Hoffa's legacy is forever tangled with mystery. Declared legally dead on July 30th, 1982, exactly 7 years after he vanished, his case remains one of the greatest unsolved disappearances in U.S. history. Memorials have been held, books and films made, and his story retold countless times. Yet the man himself was never found, and no confession ever brought full closure. In popular culture, Hoffa has been portrayed by icons like Jack Nicholson and Al Pacino. His life has inspired countless books, documentaries, and conspiracy theories. Streets and towns still whisper his name. Was he a tragic hero undone by ambition? Or a criminal who paid the ultimate price for power? Perhaps he was both. What remains is a legacy built on strength, struggle, and shadow. The man who once said, "I may have my faults, but being wrong ain't one of them," left behind a trail that still fascinates historians, investigators, and the public alike. Thank you very much for watching.